Look, it's been a distressing time, I know, for everyone to see this, disruption to the world, the second and third order effects that we're all experiencing, but also most particularly the suffering, no doubt, of those who are caught up in the fighting. But let me begin by offering my condolences to the families of the Iranians who've been brutally slaughtered by this terrible regime in recent weeks. And it's continuing, of course, as we speak. But the tens of thousands who were massacred in the lead up to the initiation of the actual military action has been horrendous. It's not just that they were slaughtered in the streets, but they were tortured, they were mutilated, women had their eyes poked or one eye poked out, they were raped to prevent them from going to paradise. Just the extent of the horror and the brutality has been unimaginable. And of course, this reflects the state of mind of what is a group of medieval savages that are running this country. And we'll talk about the ideology that underpins that. But certainly, if the Security Council were to authorise military action in the face of that horrendous brutality, it would basically qualify as a humanitarian intervention under modern international law. But that can only take place where there is a Security Council mandate in that respect. So the question then becomes whether or not the actions that are being taken by Israel and the United States in particular, but now we're seeing other Gulf states and states in the region involved who have all come under attack from Iran, now looking at engaging in the conflict itself and taking action to protect themselves. So what's the legality of all this? And it's really terrible to witness again how lawfare is being waged here, how the law is being vandalised and sabotaged and misinterpreted quite deliberately by those who have particular barrows to push and axes to grind. We'll use a few metaphors here. But really it's just a continuation of a situation where they have a partisan brief in support of particularly these heinous terrorist organisations and trying to whitewash them and portray them as legitimate movements and that we should all get behind them. Iran is no different from that. We've seen, bizarrely, people rush to the defence of these medieval savages. And let's understand this has been going on ever since the regime was created, the brutal treatment of women. And here we've just had International Women's Day. And where was the global outrage and support for Iranian women in the situation that they've been facing all along? They have not been able to lead the sort of lives that any of us would wish for them and that we expect as our right as citizens living in Australia. So that is one point, that if the Security Council was functional, they could have worked to do more in this situation. But of course, the way the Security Council is impeded at the moment by the permanent five particularly that occupy those critical seats that hold the veto power, it makes it difficult then to take action along those lines of a humanitarian intervention. So is this conflict therefore lawful in any other way? And so that requires unpacking the background to this conflict. And the truth of the matter is that this is a continuous armed conflict that has been in existence since at least 1982. When the Islamic Revolution was successful in Iran and this regime came into power, of course, almost straight away got involved in a horrendous war, defending themselves in this case against Iraq, which began in 1980 and lasted until 1988. But even in the midst of that, and from the start, they signalled their intent to destroy the state of Israel and refer to it only as the Zionist entity. And so to deliver on that concept, they began organising internal forces to try and create proxy armies around the region because they were not in a position to engage directly themselves in the midst of this war with Iraq. And let's understand this concept more deeply. What is the ideology that underpins all of this? So the Iranian leadership adheres totally to this concept of the 12th Imam, the Mahdi, who is meant to reveal himself at a certain point. And the Iranian leadership believes that the trigger for the 12th Imam revealing himself is the total destruction of Israel and the slaughter of all Jews. But that's not where it ends. When the 12th Imam reveals himself, then that is the trigger for the Islamicization of the entire globe. And that means you get a choice to accept Islam or die. And so that is the ultimate objective of this regime, every bit as heinous an ideology as the Nazis, and driving us to the position where we must resort to the very same measures that were required to deal with the Nazi regime to deal with this regime. And that differentiates it also from non-state terrorist organisations. It's a terrorist state, and it gets the opportunity to use its sovereign position as a state to sit in the councils of the world, to manipulate them, to whitewash its activities, to use all of the sovereign status and powers to pursue these terrible objectives and its aggression. And from the beginning, it never believed in traditional diplomacy. It's always believed in creating terror and threat as a means of achieving its objectives and its status as a hegemon in the region. And ultimately, it seeks to be the global leader of Islam. And so within that concept as well, we've seen the creation of what they call vilayet resistance. Now that it sits under their overall umbrella that they describe as the axis of resistance, but a vilayet resistance is what they're trying to achieve. Now what that means is that each organisation within that umbrella must accept the total control and fealty to the supreme leader, the Ayatollah Khamenei, as he was, and it looks like now we're going to get another Ayatollah Khamenei, only it's his son. But in any event, that supreme leader role commands the IRGC and the Quds force that we've talked about previously on our program. And these vilayet, proxy, galaxy of thugs and medieval savages that they created must accept the control of the leadership and the direction, and also as a consequence of that, they receive all of the training they need, all of the support they need, all of the weapons and all of the facilitation of their activities. It's really become quite a monstrous spiderweb right across the region, but which bleeds out globally to terrorist and other actions. So the first cab off the rank in this respect was Hezbollah, that they created in 1980 to 82 and launched it in its aggression in 1982. And so it initiated the long-standing war that has been in existence between Iran and Israel since that time. And it's not unusual historically. I mean, we had the 7 Years' War, which was almost a global conflict, often described as the first of the world wars, involving the two big blocks of the Anglo-Prussian versus the Franco-Austrian blocks. But we had the 100 Years' War between Britain and France. And of course, we had the 30 Years' War in Europe that involved a lot of the Central Powers at the time. So, and even World War II more recently lasted for 6 years. And a war can have pauses during that time. What starts a war under international law is simply the acts of aggression and attack, and they can be either boots on the ground going into a country or the launching of indirect attacks through missiles, rockets, and the like. And this is all spelled out in Article 8 of the Rome Statute, which defines the war of aggression war crime, which was now codified after World War II, of course, where it was made a central piece of the Nuremberg process. So war of aggression is seen as the most serious of war crimes, but within Article 8 it also includes a subparagraph G, which brings into effect aggression carried out by proxies, so mercenaries, armed groups, etc., that are operating under the behest of a particular state, and sheets home responsibility to the leaders of that state in relation to the commission of this war crime. So that's the legal basis for saying that Iran and its leadership And of course, its proxies are all guilty of committing the war crime of aggression starting from 1982. And that it has been sporadic ever since. Now, it's equivalent to being some soldier sitting on a battlefield with an opponent in front of him who pauses to reload his weapon. It doesn't mean that you've got to wait for your enemy to reload the weapon. It doesn't mean the fighting's over, and it is perfectly legitimate for that soldier sitting out there watching his enemy reload to take action first and to seek advantage in the context of an ongoing conflict. And that's exactly what's been happening now. So when we list all of the aggression, it's so extensive. So in 1982, Hezbollah began and executed a series of techniques against Israel, including cross-border attacks, rocket fire, which now has reached the level of tens of thousands of rockets and missiles over the years, and kidnapping attempts and the like. And then in 1992, a direct attack in Buenos Aires in Argentina, where Hezbollah attacked the Israeli embassy. And of course, that was followed by the horrendous 1994 bombing, which we talked about in our earlier episodes, of the Jewish Community Centre in Buenos Aires, which killed 85 people. So that wasn't a direct attack on Israel, but they've always included the Jewish community as effectively part of that Zionist entity problem. In the war in Lebanon in 2006, they fired thousands of rockets into northern Israel at the behest of Iran. Between 2018 and 2020, we had multiple attempts to infiltrate, and they sent a lot of attack drones into Israel and placed IEDs along the border. And between October, of course, 2023 to 2024, Hezbollah chimed in with the Hamas attack, the horrendous, atrocious attack, an invasion of southern Israel, again at the direction of Iran, through the status that Hamas had evolved by that time of being effectively one of these Vilayet resistance groups. And the attack that Hamas launched at that point was meant to be coordinated closely with Hezbollah and these other armed groups. And we'll talk about all of those armed groups in a minute. But Hamas had jumped the gun a little bit because they were worried about an imminent decision by Saudi Arabia to enter the Abraham Accords. And they apologised to Hezbollah for going early. And thank God they did in that sense, because a combined assault at the same time involving both Hamas and Hezbollah would have very seriously stretched Israeli resources. But in any event, it was the beginning of a 7-front attack on Israel from not only the Houthis in Yemen and Hamas and Hezbollah, but also from various groups. And there are about 9 different groups that Iran operates in various countries like Syria and Iraq and Bahrain and other places. So this galaxy was triggered and began attacking Israel from October the 7th, 2023 onwards. So it all began, as I say, with Hezbollah, but it grew enormously since then. And the amount of funding has been enormous. The weaponry that comes from Iran or provided from Iran as acquired by Iran from North Korea, but also as manufactured by Iran, and their assistance in helping Hamas and other groups to manufacture this weaponry in their own right and supplying them either by land, sea, air, whichever means. They've all been tried and used over many years and decades. So not only do they own these groups effectively, but another means by which you become party to a conflict is if you have substantial involvement. And certainly Iran meets that test as being a legitimate target for being substantially involved in these conflicts, even if you were to make an argument that they weren't under sort of direct command and control, which I would argue has been established. We've seen leaked speeches by IRGC commanders to their troops describing the situations of who they rate and how they rate these different organisations as their Vilayet resistance status that they try to achieve with them. So in any event, all of these attacks that have been going on since 1982 to today have been continuous. There have been pauses, but it's been a long-running international armed conflict, and therefore we shouldn't see this latest episode as something new. Effectively, it was a pause by Iran while they reloaded, and they were in the process of responding to the significant strike capability that the US was able to deliver with their GBU 57 deep penetrating ordnance, now pursuing the objective of getting further subsurface beyond the reach of any ordnance that is going to be available now or for some time in the future at least. But that would have given them the immunity to proceed to develop and refine their ballistic missiles and to weaponize them for nuclear attack. And it's very clear that, as opposed to some states that acquire nuclear weapons and we're unhappy about it, in the case of Iran acquiring nuclear weapons, it would be catastrophic because they would use them. They would use them because they could achieve their goal of destroying Israel that way and trigger this arrival of the 12th Imam. And of course, when they've been asked about the fact that, well, there are 2 million Muslims living in Israel, which is also ignored by a lot of the commentators that we see talking about the situation. Israelis are Arab citizens, 2 million of them, who would be incinerated, but also the fallout, of course, from such an attack would affect a lot of Muslims in the area, the direct area. So many would die, and we're talking vast numbers. So when this was put to them, the response is, well, these would be instant martyrs who would go straight to paradise. So this is the sort of warped thinking that we see from the Iranian regime. So certainly it's not only a matter of there being a situation of Israel exercising its right of self-defense here, but the interests of the world in eliminating an aggressive, heinous regime that could rain down nuclear catastrophe, not just on Israel, but other locations as well. So it's incumbent on all of us to support whatever is needed to do to stop that from happening. But of course, when we talk about the nuclear threat and the ability of Iran to get there, they've certainly been aided by others to do it, but at least we've been able to constrain other countries within a regime of engagement to prevent the usage of those weapons in modern times. So that's the picture that we have with Iran and the threat that it poses, and Israel being under an existential threat from that nation. Therefore, not only are they acting in self-defense, which is preserved under Article 51 of the UN Charter, regardless of what the Security Council is capable of doing or does do at any given moment, when you come under armed attack, Article 51 has preserved your inherent right to self-defense. So it does flag that that operates until the Security Council can intervene and deal with the situation. But if it can't, and it doesn't, and in any event, even while it's doing that, you're perfectly legitimate in responding to armed attacks against you and preventing them and neutralizing them. So what we're seeing in the case of Israel is a perfect right of self-defense. But not only does it preserve the inherent right of an individual state to self-defense, but the overall principle under international law of collective self-defense as well. So even if there hadn't been the multiple attacks that Iran has conducted against the United States over the years, they would be legitimately responding to Iran and dealing with Iran in the way we're seeing as an act of collective self-defense with Israel. So there's no way you can argue that this use of force is contrary to international law in terms of the rights of self-defense and use of force. What comes into play, of course, in every armed conflict are the other rules, or the laws of armed conflict, which relate to proportionality and the precautions in attack, etc. And what we've been seeing in Iran are very precisely targeted attacks. Now, that doesn't mean there won't be mistakes and collateral damage, but it's not carpet bombing and it's not indiscriminate, as we are seeing actually employed by Iran. They are shooting the works in this demonic fireworks display now, which is this macabre involvement of almost every country in the region. And we're talking about up to 13 countries now who have been attacked directly by Iran. And not just looking at US bases, but also attacking civilian infrastructure. We've seen desalination plants attacked in Bahrain and the UAE. We've seen airports attacked. We've seen civilian infrastructure, civilian buildings have been struck. And one of the most horrendous of these two, which we haven't seen a single comment about internationally, has been the fact that an Iranian missile struck the largest Palestinian hospital supporting the Palestinian population in the West Bank that sits in East Jerusalem. Nowhere near any kind of a military target, reflecting a lot of the indiscriminate attacks that have been launched against Israel, but are also occurring now, as I mentioned, in these other countries. So this is, what we're witnessing, a country that obeys no rules, adheres to no laws other than their law of brutality and extremism to deliver on their ideology and their goals of hegemony and domination of the Islamic world. So we should be very clear about that, that there's absolutely no violation of international law in the conduct of these operations by Israel and the United States, other than the ones that they have to adhere to in terms of targeting, which there's no evidence that they are not, even though it seems there may have been one collateral damage incident of a mistake, and that certainly needs to be investigated. So that's where we'll leave that international law question. I think it's one that shocks me in terms of being added now to this list of vandalism to international law that we've seen take place in relation to this allegation of genocide as well. What we might do further down the track as proceedings in the South African case against Israel evolve more is to unpack that for you and really work through every aspect of the legal elements of what's required to establish the crime of genocide in a court of law. And that's the only place where you can get an absolute determination, because genocide is not a colloquial word, it is a legal term of art, and it will only be resolved in the process of a court hearing, as the UK government and the Australian government have noted. So that's the situation, I think, with this issue of lawfulness of the war that's going on. And I guess the question then begs itself is, where do we go from here? What's the situation with the so-called day after kind of concept? Because it's been clearly flagged almost from the start of this conflict that regime change is sought. And I think it's so obvious that we could go on forever in engaging in these sorts of responses and attempts to prevent Iran from developing nuclear weapons and refining its ballistic missile capability and engaging in its acts of aggression, regular acts of aggression. But that, could be endless. Any pause that there is in these sorts of strikes will be filled by Iran attempting to remediate its capabilities and pursue its capability goals. So regime change is really the only way to end this situation. That's the bottom line. But can it be achieved? The practical issue here is a big one, because you're talking about a nation of 93 million people. It's a diverse ethnic demographic as well. So you're talking about 61% of the population are Persian or Fars. About 16% are Azerbaijani or Azeri, and then about 10% are Kurdish. And then there are a range of other groups as well, of smaller numbers. But there's always the possibility of the threat of a breakup of the Azerbaijani territory being added to Azerbaijan, or the Kurdish territory forming part of a Kurdish state. So there'll be a lot of people in Iran who will be keen to get rid of the regime, but won't want to see the breakup of Iran as a geographic entity. The other issue to understand here is, of course, that Iran was a thoroughgoing police state, second only to China. We've talked about the besieged militia before and its numbers of, say, 90,000 regulars, so-called, but about 300,000 reservists, and then, of course, the 125,000 odd Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. And the problem is that all of these people in the regime are living in a kleptocracy which services their desires and their wealth, their individual wealth. At the echelon of the top level, we're talking about billions of dollars that gets creamed off. In fact, Khomeini's son is probably worth about $3 billion. So the entire wealth generation of Iran has been at the service of these kleptocrats or achieving their military capabilities. Almost none of it goes to the benefit of the Iranian people. And one of the reasons why they're in a revolutionary mood and came out, notwithstanding the slaughter that was inflicted on them, is that they are suffering. Their conditions have fomented the desire for revolution and change. They've also suffered through a terrible drought that the regime hasn't handled. So this confluence of the situation of their daily living, their suffering under the brutality of the regime and the exacerbation by the drought has really created conditions for this situation for them to rise up. But, if you do rise up and you don't have a weapon of your own, we've seen what happens. Tens of thousands of people die. Usually in an insurgent situation like this or a revolution, you need some element of the security sector to chime in. And at this stage, there is a vested interest that exists in all these groups. The third group that might be relevant to this, of course, is the Iranian army. But their leadership has obviously been created over a long period of time to be adherents to the regime and also benefit from that rapaciousness of the economy. So what you'd be looking for is perhaps lower level commanders who don't benefit from that, or even formations, agreed responses from formations of the troops themselves to engage and support an uprising. There's been no sign of that, so whether it would happen or not is an open question. And then if that can't happen and doesn't happen, then you've either got to get some external intervention, and I doubt very much if Israel and the US or anybody else has got the stomach to put troops on the ground, and not necessarily would end well anyway. And of course there was talk of gearing up the Kurds to perhaps assist across the border and assist, but as I say, that would play into other concerns that Iranians might have, and it would be seen as an external intervention and therefore not welcome. So probably to be counselled against. So really you're left with this situation where you're going to have a mass uprising of Iranians that overwhelms the sector of the security forces. And the only way that can be successful is if you really seriously, completely degrade the capabilities of the IRGC, Al-Quds, and the besieged militia. So it means that the air campaign is going to have to continue until you can completely defang the regime as much as possible. You won't achieve regime change by airstrikes alone. It's going to have to happen on the ground. And so that's an open question. We don't know if it can be successful, but you can do serious damage to the ability of the regime to respond to a mass uprising, and that will take some time to complete. As I mentioned, it's a comprehensive police state. There are all sorts of communications and technical capabilities. There's just mainly, though, the extensive network of facilities and units that can respond to destroy and slaughter anyone who stands in their way. So we can only pray that the Iranian people are delivered from this. It's worth pursuing the military objectives at the moment to try and clear a path for that to happen, because we've seen the evidence that the Iranian people are willing to do it and have been willing to accept the casualties involved. We just have to find a nexus where that intent and that bravery can meet an opportunity of a response that can't be marshalled against them of the sufficient volume to defeat it. An open question, but we should all do whatever we can to support the Iranian people in this. It should be an international effort to send all the signals that needed to be sent to the Iranian regime itself, that your days are over, that we will do everything in our power to cripple you economically, to defang you, to pursue you in every avenue that's available to the international community. If we spoke with one voice, the message may get through loud and clear, and some people then may take the action to internally rise up and neutralise the regime. The option that might be there too is, that the former Crown Prince of Iran, Reza Pahlavi, has offered to come in as a pillar of stability to supervise the transition and to ensure that a referendum is conducted that will allow the Iranian people to vote on either a republic or a constitutional monarchy like ours. So, that is an option, and one that should be explored very fully, and obviously it would be very brave of him to go in there and try that. Certainly there would be former regime elements and others that would be looking to assassinate him, and probably are now. I mean, the IRGC has been conducting operations internationally, terrorist operations against members of the Iranian diaspora and killing them. Just recently, one of the foremost feminist agitators for the rights of Iranian women was assassinated in Baghdad. So their reach is as broad as we know only too well in Australia, as we have come under attacks orchestrated by the IRGC, which is why they are now listed as a terrorist organisation. It means, of course, we would have been entitled to participate in this conflict actively in an act of self-defence in response to an attack. But the government is choosing a careful path here, but I note that they have indicated their support for the Iranian people, and long may that continue, and in any practical way that we can bring help to countries in the region for their self-defence and to the Iranian people, we should explore, including the plight of these poor Iranian soccer players who've been threatened directly, and if they returned home, one can only wonder what would be awaiting them. But of course their families still there, with all the vulnerability and the fear and the concern that those soccer players will have for their families. One can only empathise and feel so sorry for them in the situation that they're in, and we should provide them with all the support we can, including offering them asylum. So that's all I have to comment on in relation to the current situation, and we'll probably keep revisiting Iran as events unfold. But thanks for being with me, and we'll hope to talk to you again very soon. Cheers.